Is it recording now? Okay, yeah. So one of the things that I would share is that I think even the journey to find a consultant to work with you on equity and inclusion work is based on some current perspectives, principles, and practices that you can do now, right? And so I want to share some of that, and at the same time, I want to acknowledge that I'm not apart from the work. I am actually within the work still, right? So I am going to give you I usually go through a what, so what, now what sort of process. And the what is I'll share with you some perspectives. The so what are some principles and practices. And then now what is what I think it takes to awaken transformation. And just to kind of give you a little bit more context of how I do my work and where I'm coming from, I think it's really important for you to know that I am biased, right? I am biased, and I think oftentimes anybody who's trying to put forward this idea of objectivity is not being completely honest. I think objectivity is shared subjectivity, right? So really being able to acknowledge that we share some biases together, and we've kind of called it being objective. So even when I taught research and design, I thought I was teaching how to be curious, but also how to be nosy. And I was also teaching that part of being objective is knowing your subjectivity. So I wanted to share with you that some of what I'm sharing now is adapted from a talk that I gave Thursday night at the East Bay Meditation Center. So I'm a longtime resident of East Oakland, over 20 years, and doing work not just in social justice and movement work in Oakland, particularly East Oakland. Also, we launched an East Oakland neighborhood initiative that garnered us a $28 million grant from the state that we can work towards environmental justice in East Oakland. So we were just so excited to be able to get that, and it was based on a $250K planning grant that we actually did some community organizing to say, what do residents want to need to create a more healthy environment and relationship to the environment. Also projecting that East Oakland is going to be sinking into the ocean in the not too dear in the distant future, right? So how do we kind of prepare folks for understanding the environmental movement and environmental justice in particular? So today I want to share in some ways what I would characterize as my spiritual awakening. What I might call a Buddhist, an activist, and an addict walking to a bar, then a cafe, then a sanctuary. But really, more specifically, what I'm sharing is that these are just my own conjectures of someone who's a spiritual catalyst in recovery. So what I mean by that is that I am an activist. And I think as an activist, we're often doing work to build power and change policies and structures. So as someone who's spiritual, a practicing Buddhist, I'm often talking about what does it mean to know truth and be one with all, right? So this idea that there is suffering, but what we've done is create a surplus of suffering. And then I am someone who is in recovery. They're working on my own 12 steps to be able to say, what does it take for me to acknowledge that I only can act one day at a time? And then some of the practices that I'm drawing from is being able to be aware of what's up, accept what's going on, and then choose the most loving and powerful actions going forward. And so what I think we're in now is a particular context where we have many pandemics, right? The pandemics of COVID, institutional racism, police brutality, economic uncertainty, homelessness, environmental uncertainty, right? And the context is having all kinds of complexity within our communities. Communities being globally within your area as well as within your own life. And sometimes the context is within the fundamental ambiguity of being human. What is our journey? What's our experience? And what are our possibilities? And I think it's impacted us at the individual level, physically, mentally, emotionally, as well as spiritually. It's impacted our relationships, yourself, community broadly, and your work in the world, your contribution to Green Foothills, and your contribution with respect to commitments. So what I want to share is that that's what I think is the perspective. That's why this Equity Inclusion Committee exists. Isn't just because it's a new thing to focus on racial equity. It's a long-standing commitment and values and mission of Green Foothills, right? It's now, though, we've been able to acknowledge the confluence of these things. But the practice really, or at least some of the principles and practices that we need to acknowledge, is that sometimes what we do is act from a place of habit. And in a moment like now, as leaders of the organization, and in particular leaders of the Equity and Inclusion Committee, your habit might be to say, there's some urgency and we have to hurry up and figure out what to do with a consultant, what we needed to change a board, what do we need to change our practices, what do we need to do to change our organizations. And instead, I think what we need to pivot towards is pausing, really understanding deeply and broadly what is going on for us physically, mentally, emotionally, and even vibrationally. But again, as leaders, you're going to have this habit of a sense of urgency to suggest that you can actually predict and control what's going on. That it's really up to you as an equity and inclusion committee to figure out what is going to happen with COVID, what is going to happen with our communities, what is going to happen with all the racial justice protesting and demonstrating as a result of George Floyd, and on and on. And what I'm suggesting is that let's try something different. And that something different is really to continue to deeply listen and reflect on not just what you think and believe, but what your community is thinking and feeling, right? What are we doing, and are we doing it enough to be able to acknowledge what people are experiencing? Because that guiding principle is one where we need to actually practice compassion with each other. We're not leading enough with knowing how it is that we're connected with respect to people's feelings and experiences. Because really the operating principle of urgency and predict and control are two. The two are paternalism and perfectionism. The idea that just because you're in a position of leadership, that you actually know what other people are experiencing, and that it's up to you to decide what needs to happen for their benefit, or sometimes to them. Right? And that even if you go to your own small committee, that you can actually alone figure out what the right thing is to do. But again, what I think the task is, the pivot is to reckon with the world as it is. Sometimes this space and place of acceptance means, or awareness means, that we need to accept the world as glorious and the world as wretched, right? If we're expecting the world to be a certain way, that's again basing the world on expectations, not the world as it is. And so to do that differently, we are moving towards accepting the world as it is. And for me, that guiding principle is one of equanimity. Now, that may be a jargony word for some, but for us in the Buddhist community, we have what we call the Brahma Viharas, the four abodes of love, right? And that's loving kindness, that's compassion, that's appreciative joy, and that's equanimity. And simply, I would just say equanimity is being able to understand the world as it is and understand that I'm in the world as it is, right? And so it's both being able to work on it and in it simultaneously. But even if I'm working towards accepting the world as it is, there's another, that operating principle of paternalism and perfectionism suggests that we have a role, though. Our role as leaders is to solve problems, and it's to solve problems as leaders. And because within our structures, there's vertical accountability, that we as staff have to report to the board has to report to each other, right? And then the community, in some ways, even though we're serving the community, oftentimes, again, because of this operating principle of paternalism, we think because of our role that we know what the community wants and needs. And that operating principle is one of individualism and separateness. And so what I'm suggesting is that at this time, we need to pivot. We need to actually involve more people and really work from the perspective that there's nothing about us without us. In other words, looking at your board, looking at your staff, looking at your community, and saying who is most impacted by what's going on and how are they guiding what we're doing. And so we need to gather together. And the gathering together is coming from an operating principle of community. How are we structuring belonging? How are we basing our work based on collectivism rather than individualism? And so, again, the challenge with that, even if you all came together as an equity and inclusion committee that is representative of the community in many ways, the usual practice or operating principle is for your committee to hoard power. And so part of the work isn't that we're just trying to figure out how to get more power to do what we know is right for equity and inclusion. I believe it's actually to build power. One of the ways I define leadership is to develop other leaders, not find more followers. So to the task is, how are we then creating the conditions and policies and structures that allow for power sharing? So in this moment of time, with all that's going on, how are we looking at our practices to be able to share power? Now, most of when I share some of this, people will ask me, well, Renato, how do we do this? And I think the answer to the question how is yes. We do it. We do it, do the good that's in front of us. We combat this operating principle of urgency with moving at the speed of trust. Like, what are we doing to really trust other people as well as ourselves? And that's going to require something different, that we are radically transparent and vulnerable with what we know and what we need. And that's going to lead from a guiding principle of honesty. And then recognizing that all these habits that are happening on the left side is there. For me, one of the practices I have is called the 3 difficult practices, again, within Buddhism. The first one is to acknowledge our neurosis, right? Really acknowledge the crazy making and delusion that we're a part of. And part of that work is to kind of move from knowing what our habits are to really building capacity, building the power of those around us, so that we're actually structuring a sense of belonging. So community and belonging has 2 connotations for me. Like, I have a sense that I belong and what we're doing belongs to me, right? What that will do in doing that practice is actually demonstrate the principle of respect. So I wanted to share that quickly as a set of principles and practices, but I also wanted to land with this final slide that really what we're talking about. I think what I encourage you to consider for your Equity and Inclusion Committee is really the practice of ritual. Like, how do we do things intentionally? If we're just acting out of habit, like, I know I'm really good at this, you may be, but if we can go a little bit deeper and ask ourselves, to what extent is this habit a characteristic of dominance? How is it a characteristic of power over rather than power with? And if we can intentionally do our practices with a degree of ritual. The other thing is to focus on our relationships. How are we actually structuring this sense of community? And even with that, are we really talking about what we intend to do? I think there are many avenues for action, just as there are many avenues and areas of suffering. So sometimes all we can say is we're going to do the good that's in front of us. But when we're talking about practice, I think we're actually talking about power. And when we're talking about relationships, I actually think we're talking about love. And when we're talking about doing good, I actually think we're talking about justice. And so for me, it's really understanding and acknowledging that we're talking about the interdependence of power, love, and justice, not the independence of it. And that's where I love this quote from Martin Luther King Jr., where he said, you know, power and love are often seen as polar opposites, but power without love is reckless and abusive. Love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. So I want to pause there and just, open it up for any queries or pushback or clarifications, just from my own reflections as to what I think you, as well as many others, are actually facing at this time.
I really want to thank you, Renato, for bringing your wisdom and this presentation and your time today. I personally, this is similar to the presentation that Renato provided. Definitely, it was a little bit more in depth, but provided in our conversation. And I think, it's easy to see why, for all of us, like why I wanted to have him come today. So I think he really helps to frame our conversations going forward and the work ahead, and really help to challenge sort of the process, challenge kind of how we've been seeing our committee, and hopefully as we, over the coming months, redefine and reshape what this committee is doing and what this committee is talking about and working on together. Hopefully it can help us in having just if nothing, I mean, it's easy to see that, Renato, like, you're amazing. So yeah, just I'll pause there. Thank you.